we all have those aspects of ourselves we maybe prefer to keep hidden, right? Those personality quirks or impulses that feel a little, well, uncomfortable.
Definitely.
Today, on the Deep Dive, we're actually venturing into that very territory. We're focusing on Carl Jung's concept of the shadow self.
And it's really fascinating because Jung's insight, it goes beyond just, acknowledging those uncomfortable bits. Understanding our shadow can actually be a powerful tool.
How so?
Well, for explaining why we react so strongly sometimes to certain traits we see in other people, it's almost like a hidden mirror, reflecting parts of ourselves we might not really want to face.
Exactly. And this isn't about dwelling on negativity, is it? It's more about gaining a deeper understanding of what makes us tick as humans.
Precisely. It's a crucial part of being whole.
You've shared some really insightful material for this deep dive.
Right.
We've got excerpts explaining Jungian psychology from Orion philosophy, the Wikipedia entry on the shadow, and an article from the Society of Analytical Psychology.
Yeah, a good mix.
So our mission, really, is to distill the core understanding of this shadow self and maybe see how it can illuminate our own self-awareness and, our interactions with the world around us.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's get right into it then. What exactly is this shadow that Jung talks about?
Well, Jung himself, he famously said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious."
That really hits the nail on the head, doesn't it?
It really does. It underscores that crucial, though often avoided, work of acknowledging our less desirable aspects. It's not the popular path, maybe.
It makes me think immediately of that classic story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Ah, yes.
That constant struggle, between the respectable face we show the world and those impulsive, darker urges underneath. It feels like such a powerful metaphor for this.
It truly is. Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, it just brilliantly captures that internal conflict Jung was getting at.
Right.
Dr. Jekyll's attempts to suppress Hyde, to push him down, they only end up amplifying his power in the unconscious.
So trying to bury these unwanted parts doesn't actually work.
No, it highlights how trying to bury them doesn't make them disappear. It can actually give them more influence, just unseen.
So the shadow is essentially the stuff we don't like about ourselves, the things we're maybe ashamed of, those more primal, impulsive bits we try to keep under wraps, both from ourselves and definitely from others.
Precisely that. Jung put it this way: everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is.
Blacker and denser. Oh.
And a key point he made is that this unacknowledged shadow, it can unconsciously undermine our best intentions. We don't even realize it's happening.
It's that internal battle, isn't it? The me I want to be versus the part of me that might, be tempted to lose my temper or be overly critical or something I regret later.
Exactly. Jung defined the shadow as those parts of our personality that just don't align with our ego ideal.
Ego ideal.
Yeah, that mental picture we have of who we aspire to be, our best self, kind of. And here's where it gets really interesting. This rejection of our shadow aspects often leads to something called projection.
Projection. Okay, I think I've heard of that. Is it like when we sort of see our feelings or thoughts in someone else?
It's very similar. In psychological terms, it's when we take those qualities we dislike or simply can't accept in ourselves and unconsciously attribute them to other people.
Ah, okay.
That's why you might have a really intense, almost outsized negative reaction to someone's perceived arrogance, for example.
Right. You just can't stand it.
Exactly. It could actually be reflecting an unacknowledged part of yourself that you secretly fear is arrogant or that you've decided is completely unacceptable.
Wow. So the takeaway is that intense dislike of someone else's trait. It often acts like a flashing neon sign.
Pretty much. Pointing to something we haven't accepted within ourselves, it's a powerful insight, even if it's, uncomfortable.
So when Jung said, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate, he meant that if we don't confront our own inner stuff, the shadow, we'll just keep bumping into it out there.
Yeah.
In our relationships, our experiences played out externally.
Exactly. It's almost as if the unconscious is trying desperately to bring these denied aspects to our attention by showing us reflections of them in the world around us.
Okay.
And to really understand the shadow, Jung also, he built upon some of Freud's ideas too, didn't he? Particularly the concepts of the id and the ego.
He did, yeah. He viewed the id, which Freud famously described as the dark, inaccessible part of our personality, like a cauldron full of seething excitations.
Quite the image.
Right. He saw it as that primal, instinctual core. It's there from birth, driven by basic desires, impulses, the need for immediate gratification, avoiding pain, all that raw stuff.
Yeah, the id is that powerful force behind our most basic urges, hunger, comfort, survival. It operates purely on what Freud called the pleasure principle,
Just wants what it wants now.
constantly seeking immediate satisfaction without any thought for consequences or, what society thinks.
And then there's the ego.
Yeah.
That develops later as we mature and start interacting with the world.
Right.
It's a part of us that tries to make sense of reality, figure out how to navigate it effectively based on our learned values, our beliefs. So if the id is all about want, then the ego is more about how do I actually get what I want realistically in the world?
Exactly. The ego acts as the mediator, doesn't it?
It has to. It's constantly balancing the id's often pretty insistent demands with the constraints and realities of the external world. As Freud saw it, the ego assesses what's realistic and tries to delay gratification. It guides our behavior more in line with how we feel we should act, not just how we feel like acting in that instant.
And it's this ego then striving for our ideal self that often rejects the id's impulses, pushing them into the shadow.
That's the idea. The ego wants to maintain that ideal image so the parts that don't fit get repressed. But the ego isn't always like the most reliable guide, is it? I mean, sometimes it can kind of bend the truth to suit itself.
Oh, absolutely. There's a real risk of what psychologists call unconscious rationalization,
Okay.
where the ego subtly twists reality to justify the id's impulses. Think of someone who eats an entire cake and then says, "Oh, I deserved it. I had such a tough day at work."
Right, we've all done that.
That's the ego working overtime, creating a seemingly logical reason for the id's simple desire for that sugary gratification.
And as we grow and learn, hopefully our ego matures too. It gets better at figuring out which impulses are actually helpful long-term and which pains are maybe worth avoiding or working through.
Yes, it's about developing wisdom, isn't it? The ability to understand and act on that understanding, even when our more primal urges are screaming something different.
So bringing it back to the shadow self, how did Jung specifically define the shadow in this context, using the id and ego?
Jung really viewed the shadow as a kind of cognitive blind spot, an unconscious reservoir holding all those repressed desires, ideas, instincts, weaknesses, shortcomings, all the things we consciously don't want to acknowledge about ourselves.
So it's created by that tension, that gap between the want to of the id and the should be of the ego.
Yeah,
Born from our efforts to live up to our ideals.
exactly right. Jung famously said the shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be. Simple as that, almost. And as we touched on earlier, a really significant clue, maybe the biggest clue to understanding our own shadow, is noticing our intense negative reactions to specific qualities in other people.
That projection thing again.
That strong dislike often points directly to a quality we've disowned, pushed away within ourselves. That's the projection mechanism in action, basically showing us what we refuse to see internally.
It can be really uncomfortable to think about that, but confronting our shadow seems like, well, a really vital step for personal growth, doesn't it? Even if it's not always pleasant.
It is indeed. Jung himself described the shadow as a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. Pretty evocative.
Yeah.
But he also stressed that one must learn to know oneself in order to know who one is, and that journey inevitably involves confronting and understanding the shadow.
So what are some of the risks then? The potential negative consequences if we just ignore it, pretend it's not there?
Well, if we're not consciously aware of it, it sounds like it could be subtly messing with our thoughts and behaviors without us even realizing.
Like how?
We might find ourselves reacting in ways that surprise even us, becoming overly defensive about certain topics, maybe lashing out at others seemingly out of nowhere.
Right.
Precisely. Because the shadow operates largely unconsciously, its projections can negatively impact our thoughts, our actions, without our conscious awareness. We might overcompensate in certain areas.
Like being overly nice if you've repressed anger.
Maybe, yeah. Or become excessively critical of others for flaws we secretly fear we possess ourselves. Jung put it quite starkly, saying someone could be possessed by his shadow, essentially standing in his own light and falling into his own traps, living below his own level.
Living below his own level. That's powerful. And that internal struggle, that constant effort to keep the shadow down, can that also manifest in more destructive ways, like leading to unhealthy coping mechanisms or even addictions.
Absolutely. The psychic energy we expend in repressing the shadow, it doesn't just evaporate.
Right.
It often finds expression in unhealthy coping mechanisms, self-sabotaging behaviors. It's like those unacknowledged parts are trying to surface somehow any way they can.
Like in Jekyll and Hyde again.
Exactly. Eric Neumann, who built on Jung's work, suggested we all carry this inherent dark side of his own personality that really does have the potential to overwhelm our conscious intentions if we leave it unexamined.
But it's not all doom and gloom with the shadow, is it? You mentioned earlier it holds potential benefits too.
Yes, and that's a really crucial point to grasp. While the shadow definitely contains those disliked, maybe problematic aspects, it also holds untapped qualities and potentials. Things that can actually enrich our lives significantly if we can learn to access them.
Okay, like what?
Well, think about someone who believes, maybe from childhood messages, that being assertive is somehow negative or aggressive.
Yeah, I know people like that.
Their shadow might actually contain a healthy, vibrant, assertive nature. If they could embrace that, integrate it, it could empower them to set necessary boundaries in their relationships, in their career.
So the very qualities we've rejected might actually be hidden strengths just waiting.
Exactly. Other common examples. Someone who consistently suppresses their emotions because they think showing feelings is weak.
Right.
Their shadow might hold a huge capacity for genuine emotional depth, for empathy, for real connection with others, or someone who tends to be overly judgmental if they can honestly acknowledge their own shadow.
They might become more compassionate.
Precisely. Develop a greater sense of understanding for human flaws, including their own. The key insight here is that bringing the shadow into conscious awareness allows for acceptance.
And that acceptance loosens its negative grip.
It does. And it unlocks its positive, often surprising potential.
Okay, so we have a better grasp of what the shadow is, why it's so important to acknowledge it. But the million-dollar problem is, how do we actually do that? How do we start to assimilate it, as Jung called it?
Yeah, the practical side. Well, Jung himself cautioned there's no single easy technique. He compared the process more to diplomacy. It's deeply individual.
Diplomacy with yourself.
Kind of, yeah. But he did outline 3 general key steps: acceptance, awareness, and then a sort of ongoing negotiation with our shadow.
Okay, acceptance first. That just means the basic acknowledgement that, yes, the shadow is part of me and it's influencing me whether I see it or not.
Precisely. You have to start there. Then comes awareness. This is the active practice of consciously paying close attention to our own moods, our spontaneous fantasies, those sudden, often weird impulses that pop up.
How do you do that practically?
Well, practices like mindfulness meditation, just observing thoughts without judgment, and regular journaling can be incredibly valuable tools here. They help us observe the often subtle workings of our inner world.
And the negotiation part. That sounds like it wouldn't be a one-time thing.
Definitely not. It's a continuous internal dialogue and engagement. It involves accepting some aspects of the shadow, maybe still choosing to consciously reject others, discerning what ultimately serves our growth and well-being and what doesn't.
So it requires both looking inwards and paying attention to how it shows up out there.
Exactly. Honest inner reflection, plus noticing how those shadow elements manifest in our daily interactions and experiences.
You also mentioned some more practical techniques we can use for this shadow work.
Yes. One particularly powerful technique involves consciously observing our reactions to things and people. What specifically triggers an intense emotional response? What makes us instantly defensive?
Noticing those hot buttons.
Exactly. What specific traits in others do we find intensely irritating or just really dislike? These strong reactions often act as direct pointers towards our own unacknowledged shadow aspects.
Okay, what else?
Another helpful technique is to use the qualities we admire in ourselves to understand the ones we dislike. For instance, if you really value being organized, reflecting on times when you were actually disorganized and what might have driven that can offer insights into maybe a part of you that resists structure, for example.
And paying attention to our inner monologue, that constant chatter.
Yes. That stream of thoughts and self-talk narrates our lives. It can provide valuable clues about the presence and nature of our shadow, or maybe the clever stories we tell ourselves to rationalize its urges.
Right, the justifications.
Exactly. And finally, it's absolutely crucial to approach this whole exploration with a fundamental attitude of self-compassion.
Be kind to yourself through it.
Yes. Remember, everyone has a shadow. It's just part of being human. Cultivating self-awareness, understanding our feelings and thoughts right now, without judgment, and practicing radical honesty with ourselves.
Meaning accepting what we see without twisting it.
Without distortion or denial. Those are essential attitudes. Connie Zweig put it beautifully. The shadow, when it is realized, is the source of renewal. The shadow is the door to our individuality.
So growth requires going through that door.
She really underscores that idea. Genuine self-understanding, meaningful growth, it really necessitates confronting these often unseen parts of ourselves. Now, our other sources also offered some really interesting complementary perspectives.
Yes, the Wikipedia entry described the shadow as the blind spot of the psyche, which I thought was a really good phrase.
It is, isn't it?
And it highlighted how just continually repressing the id's impulses can actually prevent healthy shadow integration. It also made a fascinating point about positive aspects potentially being hidden in the shadow too.
Especially for people struggling with low self-esteem, right?
Exactly.
That's a great point. Sometimes those with a negative self-image might even repress their own strengths, their positive qualities. Maybe they see them as unacceptable somehow, like being boastful, or they feel they don't deserve them.
The Wikipedia article also introduced that really compelling concept of the collective shadow.
Ah, yes, the bigger picture.
That's the idea of shared unconscious negative feelings, impulses that tend to get projected onto specific figures, like the traditional image of the devil, maybe.
Exactly, or onto other groups.
It really connects to those primal in-group versus out-group dynamics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that dangerous tendency to dehumanize others.
It's like we collectively project all the darkness we don't want to acknowledge in our own group onto some external other. It's fascinating and frankly a bit unsettling how these archetypal figures can embody the negative stuff a whole society disowns.
Yeah.
And the Wikipedia entry also mentioned the shadow frequently appears in our dreams.
How does that work?
Often, it seems, taking the form of someone of the same sex as the dreamer. It's shaped by our unique individual experiences, of course, but it also reflects broader societal repressions and taboos.
And it discussed shadow work in more detail too, didn't it? Mentioning techniques like active imagination.
Which is like intentionally engaging in daydreaming or meditative states, yeah.
And various forms of creative expression art, music as ways to encounter and interact with the shadow more directly, often guided by insights from dream analysis. It even referenced Jung's term nekia.
That symbolic descent into the darkness of the unconscious. Very mythic.
But there's also a potential danger flagged, isn't there, of becoming too identified with the shadow.
Absolutely. The Wikipedia article wisely cautioned against the risk of merging with the shadow, where it can actually overwhelm the conscious ego and lead to destructive or negative behaviors.
So the goal isn't to become the shadow.
No, not at all. The goal is for the conscious ego to understand it, integrate parts of it, and ultimately guide it, remain in charge, so to speak.
And this process, the assimilation of the shadow, consciously acknowledging, incorporating parts of it into our ego that can lead to real personal growth, even transformative experiences.
Yes, but the caution was about maintaining grounding, right? Not letting the ego get inflated or overly identified with these newly discovered, perhaps powerful aspects.
Right. The article from the Society of Analytical Psychology also had some really valuable complementary points.
Yes, they really emphasized the shadow as a fundamental piece of our psyche's structure, alongside the persona, our public mask, and the anamnesis, those contrasexual aspects, all shaping our identity.
And they strongly reinforced Jung's view that failing to recognize and engage with the shadow is often at the very root of conflict.
Interpersonal conflicts, group tensions, societal prejudice, even large-scale conflicts like war. It's a big claim, but central to the theory.
And they also made it clear, again, that the shadow isn't just negative stuff. It also holds vital positive qualities, untapped energy like healthy assertiveness, natural instincts, even creativity.
Absolutely. They also distinguished helpfully between the personal shadow, which is made up of our own disowned bits, and the collective shadow, influenced by culturally determined oppositions to shared values.
Like things the whole society deems bad.
Exactly. They even touched on a deeper, more complex level connected to broader societal issues and the concept of evil.
And they highlighted projection again, didn't they? As the main way we bump into our shadow out in the world.
Constantly seeing our own disliked or unacknowledged qualities mirrored back at us and other people. They also pointed out how our early upbringing, the messages we get from parents, caregivers, about what's acceptable or not plays a huge role in shaping our individual shadow.
So harsh parenting could lead to a nastier shadow.
It could lead to a more hostile, deeply buried shadow, yeah. often tangled up with anxieties about abandonment, perhaps. And interestingly, they noted even positive feelings or traits can end up in the shadow if they were somehow discouraged early on.
Like if being sensitive was seen as weak.
Exactly that kind of thing.
Jung's own dream about killing Siegfried, which they mentioned,
Yeah.
that really shows the intense, often conflicting emotions that come up when we face the shadow, doesn't it?
Fear, disgust, remorse, guilt. But also, surprisingly, compassion, grief, humility. It's complex. And they made a really important point about shame often being an overlooked but significant part of this.
Shame feels key.
It often is. And the therapeutic process, as they described it, can offer a unique, safe space for the shadow to emerge.
Oh.
Through the therapist's steady positive regard, their non-judgmental acceptance of even the really difficult shadow elements. This can allow locked up psychic energy like suppressed rage and depression to be gradually released and integrated.
And ultimately, this assimilation leads to more self-acceptance, self-forgiveness.
Yes, shifting from always blaming outwards to taking some internal responsibility, relaxing that harsh inner critic. They even touch briefly on the therapist's own shadow, which is a whole other layer.
Wow. And the trickster archetype.
Yeah, as a kind of collective shadow figure that can challenge our arrogance, our rigid thinking. Linked to figures like Hermes, or even the symbolic wolf in Western culture, representing more primal, instinctual shadow aspects.
It's even been suggested Jung himself might have left some shadow work for others.
Yes. Some suggest that even in his vast work, he might have consciously or unconsciously left certain aspects of his own shadow for later generations to grapple with. Food for thought.
Wow, okay. It's incredibly clear that this concept, the shadow self, is way more complex and multifaceted than it might first seem. The implications are huge for how we understand ourselves, our relationships, even society.
Absolutely. It's really a lifelong journey, isn't it? Self-discovery, integration, ongoing awareness. It never really stops.
So to try and bring it all together then, we've explored how everyone has a shadow. It's this hidden aspect of our personality containing both the negative traits we tend to deny and that untapped positive potential we haven't yet embraced.
Both sides of the coin.
And understanding our shadow through honest self-reflection and really paying attention to our projections on others seems absolutely crucial for personal growth, for healthier relationships, just for navigating life, really.
Couldn't agree more.
This deep dive has hopefully given everyone listening a solid foundation for understanding this pretty intricate idea, drawing insights from those different expert sources.
And we hope it's offered maybe a valuable shortcut to grasping some of the core and really impactful insights from Jungian psychology about the shadow self.
Now, for one final thought to maybe take away and mull over, think about a recent strong emotional reaction you had to someone, a really intense feeling. Could that intensity be pointing towards a hidden aspect of your own shadow? And maybe flip it around. What might be the potential positive quality, the untapped energy lurking within that trait you disliked so much?
That's a great reflection exercise.
Yeah, take some time to genuinely reflect on that. Maybe even try out some of the self-reflection techniques we talked about, like journaling. And if this exploration has sparked your curiosity,
Which we hope it has.
we definitely encourage you to continue delving deeper into Jungian psychology and the concept of the shadow self. You might just uncover even more of those really valuable aha moments on your own journey of self-discovery.